Adrian Cole had learned to compartmentalize a lot of things during his 18 months on Bastion 9. The screaming of soldiers dying from wounds he couldn't fix fast enough. The smell of cauterized tissue that permeated the medical bay. The way his hands shook after particularly bad shifts until he drank enough coffee to steady them. What he hadn't learned to compartmentalize was the specific expression people got when they were dying and knew it. The clarity, the resignation, the quiet plea in their eyes for someone to tell them it was going to be okay even when everyone knew it wasn't. He'd seen that expression on his partner's face 3 years ago when the colony raid happened, and he'd been on Earth, too far away to help, able only to watch the recordings later and catalog all the ways he might have saved her if he'd been there. Now he made sure he was always there, always ready, always working, because being useful meant not thinking about the times he hadn't been. The medical bay on Bastion 9 was a joint facility, human equipment and protocols on one side, accommodations for allied species on the other, careful neutrality maintained. Because the station existed at the border between human space and Savari Ascendancy territory, where one wrong move could restart conflicts neither government wanted. Adrian had worked with plenty of non-human patients, Krell who needed their exoskeleton stabilized, Vendar who required triple oxygen concentrations, even the occasional Savari diplomatic aide who'd been injured in neutral territory and needed human medical intervention, because they were closer than their own healers. He'd learned to navigate cultural sensitivities, to ask before touching, to understand that different species had different boundaries about what medical treatment meant. The Savari were particularly complicated. They were humanoid enough that basic anatomy translated reasonably well. Respiratory system, circulatory system, neural structure all roughly analogous to human norms with some significant differences. But their culture around medicine was intricate, rooted in spiritual beliefs about bodily purity and privacy that made treatment challenging. Their healers, more priests than physicians by human standards, operated under strict prohibitions about what could and couldn't be touched, seen, or discussed. Some conditions were considered too intimate for treatment, meant to be endured with spiritual fortitude or accepted as honorable pathways to death. Adrian found this perspective deeply frustrating from a medical standpoint, but respected it as cultural difference, treating the Savari patients who came to him with extra care about consent and modesty. He'd been running through routine inventory. Medical supplies depleted faster than requisitions could replace them, which was standard for frontier stations. When the alarm sounded, Priority Alpha, Medical Emergency, Savari Diplomatic Wing. The location alone was unusual. Diplomats had their own medical facilities with culturally appropriate healers. They only called human medics for specific situations. Conditions their own healers couldn't treat, injuries that occurred in neutral territory, or emergencies where human medicine offered advantages their spiritual healing practices couldn't match. Adrian grabbed his emergency kit and ran, his mind already cataloging possibilities. Combat injury, environmental exposure, allergic reaction to something in the station's non-Savari sections. He reached the diplomatic wing in under 2 minutes, was cleared through security by guards who looked simultaneously relieved and terrified to see him, and entered quarters that were elegant in ways human spaces never managed, all flowing fabrics and ambient lighting that shifted like living things. Ambassador El Sindra was on the floor. Adrian recognized her immediately. He'd seen her at station briefings, moving through corridors with the kind of graceful authority that came from decades in diplomatic service. She was Savari nobility, evident from the intricate jewelry decorating her elongated ears, the formal robes that marked her rank, the way even human commanders showed her respect. Now she was collapsed against a low platform that served as Savari furniture, her breathing shallow, her skin tone wrong in ways that suggested cardiovascular distress. 3 Savari attendants stood nearby, maintaining careful distance, and the terror in their expressions told Adrian everything he needed to know before they said a word. "What happened?" he asked, dropping beside Sindra and starting assessment, pulse rapid and thready, respirations labored, signs of shock setting in. The senior attendant, a male whose ear jewelry marked him as medical personnel, spoke in heavily accented English. "She collapsed 20 minutes ago, complained of severe pelvic pain, inability to stand. We called healers immediately. He stopped, seemed to struggle with the words. They examined her remotely and determined the condition is located in sacred regions. They cannot treat her. It is forbidden." Adrian pulled out his portable scanner, running it over Sindra's lower abdomen. The readout made his stomach drop. Vascular clot, significant, positioned in the pelvic venous system. Probably formed due to long-term null-gravity exposure combined with genetic predisposition, now blocking blood flow enough to cause the shock symptoms he was seeing. Treatable with immediate intervention. Fatal if left untreated for much longer. "She needs emergency treatment now," Adrian said, already preparing medication. "Thrombolytic therapy to dissolve the clot, ultrasound-guided to ensure we're targeting the right area. I'll need her moved to a proper medical bed, and—" "You cannot," the attendant interrupted, voice strained. "The location of the obstruction, it is in areas we do not speak of, do not touch, do not acknowledge except in most sacred contexts. For healer to treat this would violate every spiritual law. For anyone to see, to touch." He made a gesture Adrian didn't understand but clearly meant something profound. Only life-bonded partners or those who have undergone decades of spiritual preparation may approach such places. She has no partner. She has no prepared healer. She is dying and we cannot help her. Adrian looked at the woman struggling to breathe, at the attendants who were bound by their culture from doing what needed to be done, at the scanner reading that showed time running out. He thought about his partner, about watching her die on a recording because he couldn't reach her. Thought about every patient he'd lost because he wasn't fast enough or skilled enough or there enough. "I can help her," he said clearly. "I'm human. We don't have those restrictions. If the treatment requires touching or seeing areas your culture considers private, that's a medical necessity and I'm trained for it. Do I have your permission to proceed?" The attendants looked at each other, some rapid exchange in Savari that Adrian didn't catch. Finally, the senior medical attendant nodded, though his expression suggested he was agreeing to something terrible. "You have permission. But understand, what you do here will have consequences beyond medicine. In Savari culture, such intimate contact cannot be casual. It creates bonds, obligations. You will be," he struggled for the English word, "changed by this. As will she. Right now I'm concerned with keeping her alive," Adrian replied, because he'd process cultural complications later when his patient wasn't dying. "Help me move her to that platform and then please step outside. She deserves privacy for this." They moved her carefully, the attendants retreating immediately after, and Adrian found himself alone with Ambassador Sindra, who was conscious but fading. Her silver eyes, distinctive Savari feature, reflective and unsettling, focused on him with effort. "Human physician," she said, voice weak. "You understand what they told you, what this treatment means in my culture." "I understand it's complicated and that we'll deal with complications after you're not dying," Adrian replied, prepping the ultrasound equipment. "Right now I need you to stay with me, stay conscious if you can, and let me work. I'm going to explain everything I'm doing, and if you need me to stop at any point, you tell me. Understood?" She managed something that might have been a nod. "Proceed." Adrian worked with the focused intensity that came from years of emergency medicine, administering thrombolytics while using ultrasound to guide the medication precisely to the clot's location. The procedure required physical contact in areas that Savari culture clearly considered sacred: pelvic region, lower abdomen, areas he'd treat without hesitation on a human patient, but which clearly carried profound cultural weight here. He narrated everything as he worked, keeping his voice calm and professional, treating her with the same careful respect he'd give any patient in vulnerable circumstances. "You're doing great," he said as the medication began working, the clot slowly dissolving on his scanner display. "Blood flow is improving. Pain should start decreasing soon. Just keep breathing for me." Syndra's breathing was already steadying, color returning to her skin as circulation normalized. She watched him throughout with those silver eyes, and Adrian couldn't read the expression. Pain still, obviously, but also something else. Trust maybe, or recognition. The procedure took an hour. When it was done, the clot was gone, her vitals had stabilized, and she'd recover fully with appropriate follow-up care. Adrian cleaned up his equipment with practiced efficiency, preparing discharge instructions in his head. She'd need monitoring, probably anticoagulation therapy for a while, lifestyle modifications to prevent recurrence. "You'll need follow-up in 72 hours, he said, running one final scan to confirm success. "And we should discuss prevention strategies because of the factors that caused this." "You have seen me," Syndra interrupted, her voice stronger now but carrying weight he didn't understand. "Touched me, saved me in my most vulnerable moment." She pushed herself more upright, wincing slightly but managing it. "By the laws of my people, you have invoked the right of intimacy. Do you understand what that means?" Adrian, exhausted from the intensity of the procedure and focused on medical protocols, answered honestly. "Not really. I was treating a medical emergency. I'm glad you're going to be okay, and we can discuss whatever cultural protocols I should have followed differently. But right now, I just need to make sure you're stable and—" "Stop," she said gently, and something in her tone made him stop moving, stop talking, just look at her. "In Savari culture, the areas you just treated, touched, saw, examined with your instruments, are considered so private, so sacred, that even speaking of them directly is taboo. Only life-bonded partners may share such intimacy, or healers who have spent decades in spiritual preparation specifically for these situations. You are neither, yet you touched me without hesitation, saw me without shame, trusted me with vulnerability I could not offer to anyone else." She took a careful breath. "By our most ancient laws, this creates the right of intimacy, an unbreakable bond. You become my consort, my protector, my partner in all things. Because such trust, once given and received, cannot be casual." Adrian stared at her, his tired brain trying to process this, trying to find the angle that made it make sense. That's not. I was treating a patient. I'm a doctor. This is what I do. You can't bind someone to a relationship through emergency medicine." "In my culture, we can," Syndra said, and her expression held resignation mixed with something that might have been fear. "And we do. The right exists precisely for these situations, to acknowledge that some forms of saving require intimacy so profound that it changes relationships fundamentally. You saved my life by seeing me in ways no one else has. By our law you are bound to me now, and she stopped. "I am bound to you." The door opened. The attendants returned, no longer maintaining distance, and the way they looked at Adrian had changed, not hostile exactly, but wary. Recognizing something that hadn't existed an hour ago. "The human has invoked the right," the senior attendant said in Savari, then translated for Adrian's benefit. "This must be reported to our government immediately. Ambassador Syndra, do you acknowledge the right was properly invoked?" Syndra looked at Adrian for a long moment, her silver eyes searching his face. Then quietly, "I acknowledge it. The human physician saved my life through intimacy that could only exist within sacred bonds. The right is invoked, witnessed, and binding." Adrian opened his mouth to argue, to explain that this was a medical procedure and not some kind of marriage ceremony, to point out that he'd just been doing his job. But the attendants were already moving, communicating rapidly, and through the quarters windows he could see activity increasing in the diplomatic wing. People moving with purpose, messages being transmitted. the specific kind of controlled chaos that meant something significant had just happened. He'd saved a life. Somehow, that had become a diplomatic incident, and judging by the way Ambassador Sindra was looking at him, with gratitude mixed with apology mixed with something that might have been hope, the complications were only beginning. The next 72 hours proved that diplomatic incident was a significant understatement. Adrian was pulled into no fewer than 8 meetings with human command, each one featuring increasingly agitated officers, trying to understand how their trauma surgeon had accidentally bound himself to a high-ranking Savari diplomat through medical treatment. The explanations got repetitive. Yes, he'd treated a vascular clot. Yes, the location required intimate examination. No, he hadn't known about the right of intimacy. Yes, he'd do the exact same thing again because letting someone die to avoid cultural complications wasn't medicine. It was malpractice. Commander Wei, the station's ranking military officer, looked like she'd aged a decade. Dr. Cole, I understand you were acting under medical necessity, but you have to understand the position this puts us in. The Savari government is currently debating whether the right was legitimately invoked, with factions arguing that you couldn't have created a valid bond because you didn't understand what you were doing. So it's invalid, Adrian said, trying to find the angle that let him return to work. Cultural misunderstanding, easily resolved. Except Ambassador Sindra acknowledged the right publicly, declared it binding. And now her government is split between traditionalists who say a human consort is impossible, and progressives who say refusing the right dishonors her vulnerability. Wei pulled up holographic documents covered in Savari script. Do you know what the right of intimacy actually entails? I'm getting a crash course, Adrian replied dryly, because he'd spent the past 2 days reading every cultural document he could access. The right was ancient, predating Savari space travel, rooted in a society that considered certain parts of the body so private that even medical treatment required spiritual preparation. To allow someone to see and touch these areas created obligation, acknowledging that such vulnerability could only be shared with those worthy of absolute trust. Historically, it was invoked between lovers formalizing relationships, or in rare emergencies where spiritually prepared healers treated conditions that required intimate access. But never, in thousands of years of recorded history, by an outsider who didn't understand the cultural weight of his actions. The political implications are significant, Wei continued. Ambassador Sindra was being positioned for a marriage alliance with House Keyleth, one of the most powerful noble families in Savari territory. That alliance would have secured resource-sharing agreements we've been negotiating for years. If she's bound to you instead, then those negotiations fall apart and I'm the reason, Adrian finished. I get it, but I was treating a patient who would have died without intervention. What was I supposed to do? You were supposed to, Wei stopped, ran a hand over her face. I don't know, this situation isn't in any manual, but you need to be prepared for what comes next. The Savari government is sending a delegation to assess whether the right should be honored or dissolved, and there are factions who would prefer it dissolved before you can formalize the bond. Formalize? The right creates preliminary obligation, Wei explained. But it must be ratified through ceremony within a specific time frame, or it becomes void. You have approximately 10 standard days. If you refuse to ratify, the bond dissolves. Ambassador Sindra returns to her political marriage negotiations, and we all pretend this never happened. If you accept, she looked at him steadily. If you accept, you become consort to Savari nobility, subject to their cultural obligations, and both our governments spend the next decade negotiating the legal complications. Adrian sat with that information, trying to process it. What does Sindra want? She hasn't said publicly, but my understanding is that she's being pressured heavily to request dissolution, to declare the right was invoked under duress, and doesn't represent genuine choice. Was it under duress? She was dying. Maybe she felt like she had to accept because refusing would mean rejecting help. Maybe, Wei agreed, which is why you need to talk to her. Directly, privately, and figure out what both of you actually want before politics makes the decision for you. The meeting ended with Adrian being placed on medical leave, officially for rest, unofficially because command didn't want him treating patients while his political status was undefined. He was escorted back to his quarters by security who were theoretically there for protection, but felt more like guards, and spent several hours staring at the ceiling, trying to figure out how emergency medicine had become relationship negotiations. His communicator chimed. Message from Ambassador Sindra, requesting a private meeting in neutral territory. Adrian responded with agreement, partly because he needed answers, mostly because avoiding her felt cowardly. They met in one of the station's observation lounges. Large viewports showing the star field beyond, comfortable seating, designed for cross-species use. Empty at this hour because most personnel were on duty. Sindra arrived exactly on time, wearing simpler robes than her formal diplomatic garb but still elegant, her ear jewelry glinting in the ambient light. She looked healthier than when he'd last seen her, color fully returned, moving without the pain that had characterized her emergency. "Dr. Cole," she greeted formally, "thank you for meeting with me." "Call me Adrian," he said, because formality felt wrong after he'd literally saved her life through intimate medical treatment. "And you don't need to thank me. How are you feeling?" "Physically much improved. Your follow-up instructions have been helpful." She sat with characteristic Savari grace, posture perfect even in casual context. Emotionally and politically, significantly more complicated. "Yeah, I'm getting that impression." Adrian sat across from her, maintaining respectful distance. "Your people are debating whether to honor the right or dissolve it. Among other things." Sindra's silver eyes met his directly. "I should explain what the right truly means beyond the political complications. In Savari culture, there are levels of relationship, professional, social, familial, and intimate. Intimate bonds are considered sacred because they require absolute vulnerability, absolute trust. When you treated me, you saw and touched parts of my body that only life-bonded partners ever access. That created intimacy that cannot be undone." "But I was doing my job," Adrian protested. "I'm a doctor. Treating patients requires seeing and touching things. That's not intimacy, that's medicine." "To you, perhaps. To my people, the distinction is irrelevant. Intent matters less than action. You trusted me enough to be vulnerable, and I trusted you enough to allow it. That trust is what creates the bond." She paused. "I want you to understand something important. I could have refused treatment, could have chosen to die rather than allow such intimacy with someone outside sacred bonds. Some Savari would have made that choice." "That's insane." "That is our culture." She said it without defensiveness, simply stating fact. "But I chose to live, chose to trust you when you knelt beside me and promised to help, and now I must face the consequences of that choice." Adrian studied her expression, trying to read what she wasn't saying. "Your government wants you to dissolve the right, to say it was invoked under duress." "Yes, was it?" Sindra was quiet for a long moment, her fingers unconsciously touching the jewelry on her ears. "I was dying. I accepted treatment because the alternative was death. Does that constitute duress?" She met his eyes. "But I also remember your voice, calm and steady, telling me you would keep me safe. Remember trusting you in that moment more completely than I have trusted anyone in my diplomatic career. The right may have been invoked by medical necessity, but the trust was real. And that is what I must decide, whether to honor that truth or prioritize political convenience." "What do you want?" Adrian asked. "Not what your government wants, not what's diplomatically easiest. What do you actually want?" The question seemed to surprise her. "No one has asked me that." "I'm asking now." She looked out the viewport at the stars, took a breath that seemed difficult. I want to believe that trust matters more than politics, that being saved by you, being seen and helped without judgment, was significant beyond its medical success. I want the right to be real rather than just cultural obligation. She turned back to him. But I will not force you to accept a bond you never intended to create. You saved my life out of professional duty. Asking you to become my consort because of that would be, she searched for the word, unfair. So you're offering me an out, Adrian said slowly. A way to dissolve the right, let you return to your political marriage, and pretend this never happened. But I am offering you a choice, Sindra corrected. The same choice I had when you offered treatment, accept with all complications, or refuse and face different consequences. But before Adrian could respond, the station alarms blared, not medical emergency, but security alert. His communicator exploded with notifications, and through the observation lounge's windows he could see emergency teams mobilizing. Commander Wei's face appeared on his comm screen. Dr. Cole, there's been an explosion in Medical Supply Depot 7. Preliminary assessment indicates deliberate sabotage. You were scheduled to inventory that depot this evening. But Adrian felt cold spread through his chest. I was pulled off duty this morning, medical leave. Which probably saved your life, Wei said grimly. Someone targeted that location knowing you'd be there under normal circumstances. We're locking down the station and beginning investigation. Get to secure quarters immediately. The comm cut off. Adrian stood slowly, trying to process what he'd just heard, trying not to think about how close he'd come to being in that depot when it exploded. Sindra stood as well, her expression tight with something that might have been fury. This is House Clot, she said quietly. The noble family I was meant to marry. They want the right dissolved so the alliance can proceed. And the simplest way to dissolve it, she stopped, silver eyes fierce. The simplest way is to ensure you are not alive to ratify it. Adrian's mind caught up with the implications. If I die before the ceremony, the right becomes void. But yes, and I return to being available for political marriage. The resource agreements proceed, and everyone pretends a human medic wasn't murdered to preserve diplomatic convenience. Her voice carried controlled rage. This is unacceptable. Security arrived within minutes. Both human personnel and Savari guards assigned to protect Sindra, now apparently assigned to protect Adrian as well. They were escorted to secure quarters in the diplomatic wing, rooms designed to withstand significantly more than explosions. Commander Wei arrived shortly after with preliminary investigation reports. The device was sophisticated, she said, pulling up technical schematics. Shaped charge designed to look like equipment malfunction, timed for when Dr. Cole would normally be working. Whoever placed it had detailed knowledge of his schedule and station layout. She looked at Sindra. Ambassador, do you have information about who might be responsible? House Clot has significant resources and agents throughout this region, Sindra replied. But I cannot prove their involvement without evidence you likely cannot obtain. We're working on it, Wei said. In the meantime, Dr. Cole is under protective custody. He doesn't move without armed escort, doesn't return to public areas, and absolutely doesn't go anywhere near medical facilities until we've secured them. Commander, Sindra said carefully, I invoke diplomatic privilege to request Dr. Cole be placed under my personal protection. As one party to the right of intimacy, I have cultural authority to ensure his safety until ratification or dissolution is determined. Wei looked between them, clearly calculating political ramifications. That's highly irregular. So is attempting to murder a human physician to nullify sacred Savari law, Sindra replied. I will not allow Adrian to die because my people's politics value alliances over honor. The use of his first name wasn't lost on Adrian. Neither was the steel in her voice, the diplomat's mask cracking to show the person beneath who was genuinely furious that someone had tried to kill him. Wei must have heard it too because she nodded slowly. Approved. But you both stay in secure diplomatic quarters with full security detail until this is resolved. Understood. They agreed. Wei left to continue the investigation. And Adrian found himself in elegant Savari quarters that smelled like something floral he couldn't identify, with a woman he'd saved through emergency medicine, who was now apparently responsible for keeping him alive. "I'm sorry," Sindra said after a long silence. "You saved my life, and the gratitude of my people is assassination attempts and political chaos." "Not your fault," Adrian replied, sitting on furniture that was slightly wrong for human proportions but close enough. "You didn't ask to have a medical emergency, and you didn't ask for your culture to have incredibly complicated intimacy laws. No, but I did ask you to treat me, trusted you with vulnerability that created this bond." She sat across from him, and the diplomatic composure was gone entirely, replaced by exhaustion and genuine fear. "I have been a diplomat for 23 years by your calendar. I have negotiated treaties, prevented conflicts, represented my people across dozens of worlds. And I have been alone for all of it, respected but not known, trusted with politics but not with genuine connection. When you treated me, when you spoke to me like a person rather than a political function, I felt seen in ways I had forgotten were possible." Adrian heard the loneliness in her voice, recognized it because he'd been carrying the same thing since his partner died. "So the right matters to you, not just politically but personally." "Yes," she said quietly, "which is why I cannot ask you to accept it. You saved me out of professional duty. Binding you to my life because of that would be using your compassion against you. And I will not do that, even if dissolving the right means returning to isolation I have accepted as the price of service." "But what happens if we dissolve it?" Adrian asked, "specifically to you." Sindra was silent for a moment. "I return to marriage negotiations with House Keyleth. The alliance proceeds. Resource agreements are signed. Politically, everything returns to how it was meant to be." She paused. "Personally, I spend the rest of my life knowing that the one time I trusted someone completely, I had to pretend it didn't matter. And if we ratify it, then you become bound to Savari cultural obligations you do not understand. You will be expected to learn our customs, attend diplomatic functions, represent me in contexts where I cannot be present. You will be consort to someone whose political enemies will see you as target or leverage. Your medical career will be complicated by the fact that your partner is Savari nobility." She met his eyes. "Your life will never be simple again, Adrian. And I cannot promise that the bond we create will become something genuine rather than just political obligation we both endure." Adrian sat with that, thinking about the past 3 years. Thinking about how he'd been running from connection because his partner died and he couldn't save her. How he'd buried himself in work because patience left and didn't require ongoing emotional investment. How he'd perfected being alone because alone was safe, controllable, couldn't hurt him the way losing someone hurt. But Sindra, he'd learned her given name from the cultural documents, wasn't asking him to run. She was offering him an out, yes, but she was also being honest about what she wanted. And what she wanted was to honor the trust that had been created when he'd knelt beside her and promised to help, to not pretend that vulnerability hadn't mattered. "Can I tell you something?" Adrian said finally. 3 years ago, my partner was killed in a colony raid. I was on Earth, too far away to help. I watched the recordings later, and I counted all the ways I could have saved her if I'd been there faster, smarter, better. And I decided that if I couldn't save her, I'd save everyone else. Came to the frontier, worked every shift I could, made sure I was always there, always ready." Yell listened without interrupting. "But I didn't let anyone get close," Adrian continued. "Because patients leave. They get better and go home, or they die and you move to the next case. There's no ongoing obligation, no risk of failing someone you care about because you weren't enough. I've been alone because alone meant safe." He looked at her directly. "You're offering me an out from the right, a way to return to that safety, to go back to being alone with my work, and I could take it. Probably should take it, because you're right that I don't understand Savari culture, and this is way beyond anything I'm prepared for." "But," El prompted softly, "but you trusted me when you were dying. Let me see you in ways your culture considers sacred, because you believed I would help rather than harm. And now you're being politically destroyed because you had a medical emergency and I treated it." He shook his head. "Walking away from that, letting you face the consequences alone while I return to safe isolation, that feels wrong. Feels like I'm failing someone again because I chose safety over commitment." "But you would accept the right," El said slowly, "even knowing the danger, the complications, the fact that we barely know each other outside of medical crisis." "I would accept it," Adrian confirmed, "because I'm tired of running from connection because it's risky. Because you asked me what I want, and what I want is to not let politics destroy something that started with trust. We can figure out the rest, the cultural stuff, the diplomatic obligations, whether this bond becomes something real or just something we endure together. But we can't figure any of that out if I walk away now." Yell stared at him, and something shifted in her expression. Walls coming down, hope emerging cautiously like something fragile that might break if acknowledged too directly. "You are certain, even after assassination attempts?" "Those are just making me stubborn," Adrian replied. "Nobody gets to murder me to preserve their political alliances. That's terrible motivation, but apparently it's mine now." She laughed, quiet, surprised, genuine. "You are very strange for a human physician. You're very calm about someone trying to kill your accidental consort, so I think we're even." The next 8 days were a careful dance of security protocols, political negotiations, and two people trying to actually know each other despite the circumstances trying to keep them apart. Yell taught Adrian about Savari customs, the significance of ear jewelry, the formal greetings that changed based on relationship status, the cultural weight of touch and privacy. Adrian taught Yell about human medicine, why he'd become a doctor, the specific kind of dark humor that got healthcare workers through terrible shifts. They found common ground in unexpected places. Both had chosen careers that required emotional distance. Both understood what it meant to be defined by function rather than personhood. Both were tired of being alone, even though they'd accepted it as necessary. The Savari delegation arrived on day 5. A mixture of traditionalists who wanted the right dissolved and progressives who saw it as proof that sacred law transcended species boundaries. House Keyleth sent representatives who argued that Adrian's medical treatment couldn't constitute genuine intimacy because he'd been acting under professional obligation. Yell responded by pointing out that the right required trust freely given, which she had offered, and you're motivated by stubbornness and spite toward people who tried to kill you. Also by not wanting you to be alone anymore, Adrian admitted. That seems important too. The ceremony took place in Bastion 9's diplomatic hall, witnessed by both governments and broadcast to Savari homeworld per their cultural requirements. Adrian wore formal clothes that Yell's attendants had provided, human-style suit modified with Savari elements, a compromise between cultures. Yell wore full ceremonial robes, her ear jewelry elaborate enough to mark this as significant occasion, her posture perfect despite Adrian knowing she was nervous. The ceremony itself was conducted by a Savari high priestess who'd arrived specifically for this purpose. It was formal, ritualistic, heavy with cultural significance Adrian only partially understood. He spoke the ratification vows in carefully memorized Savari, promising to honor the trust Yell had placed in him and to stand beside her despite the complications. Yell responded with the traditional acceptance, claiming him as life partner and acknowledging that he had seen her vulnerability and chosen protection over judgment. Then came the part Yell had warned him about, the offering of status. She removed the most elaborate piece of jewelry from her ears, a cuff that marked her ambassadorial rank, and held it out to him. "In Savari tradition," she said in English for human witnesses, "offering your status marker to your consort represents ultimate trust that they will honor your position even when you cannot. Adrian Cole, will you accept this trust?" Adrian took the jewelry carefully. "I will, and I promise not to lose it or accidentally trade it for coffee." Several Savari looked scandalized. Yell smiled, really smiled, the diplomat's mask falling away completely. "Your humor is inappropriate and I appreciate it." The priestess declared the right ratified, the bond recognized under Savari law and acknowledged by human authorities. The witnesses responded with formal acknowledgement, respectful if not entirely enthusiastic from all parties. And it was done. Adrian stood there holding jewelry he didn't know how to wear, bound to a woman he'd saved through emergency medicine, surrounded by people still debating whether this was diplomatic breakthrough or cultural disaster. And somehow it felt right, felt like choosing something instead of running from it. The reception afterward was brief, formal congratulations, messages of support mixed with skepticism, political analysis about what this meant for human-Savari relations. House Keyleth's representatives left without comment, which everyone agreed was probably threatening, but at least not immediately violent. Finally, they returned to their shared quarters, officially permanent now, with Adrian's belongings moved from his old medical bay housing. Yell removed her ceremonial robes piece by piece, the careful ritual of someone exhausted by formality and ready for comfort. "So," Adrian said, setting her status jewelry carefully on a table, because it seemed like the kind of thing that shouldn't be casually dropped. "We're life-bonded, consorts, partners under sacred law." "Yes," Yell confirmed, sitting with a sigh that suggested relief. "How do you feel about that?" "Uncertain, hopeful, aware that we just committed to something neither of us fully understands." He sat beside her, maintaining respectful distance, "but also glad we didn't let politics decide for us." "As am I," Yell said quietly. Then, "I have a confession. When you treated me, when you touched me in ways no one else has, I was terrified. Not of dying, but of trusting someone completely and having them reject that trust. When you accepted the right, when you chose to honor the bond despite every reason to refuse," she stopped, seemed to struggle with the words. "It mattered more than I knew how to express." "I'm glad," Adrian replied. "And I'm going to need a lot of help figuring out how to be a proper Savari consort, because I'm definitely going to insult someone important by accident within the next week." Yell actually laughed, "Undoubtedly. But I will translate your insults into something diplomatically acceptable. That is what partners do." They sat together in the quiet, two people from different worlds who'd been bound by medical necessity and chose to make it something more. They didn't know if it would work, if emergency medicine could transform into genuine partnership, if cultural differences could be bridged through mutual respect and determination. But they were willing to try. And sometimes Adrian thought that willingness was enough to start something worth keeping. "Hey, Yell," he said after a while. "Yes. Thank you for trusting me. Even though it was medically necessary and culturally complicated and politically disastrous."